Starting recording. Uh, okay, we are back. All right, we are back on part two of my discussion with Alfred Zayas. So, Mr. Zayas, you were talking about Catalonia.
Yeah, I
Catalonia.
just want to
And,
wrap it up
yes.
before we got interrupted with this phone call. Now, obviously, uh, the events of the 1st of October 2017 entailed a whole series of violations of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights by Spain. Certainly violations of Articles 1, self-determination, violations of Articles 7, personal integrity and torture. I mean, people were beaten up badly. Article 9, arbitrary detention. Article 10, conditions of detention, because they were dragged to prison and not treated nicely in prison. 14, the fact that they were arrested and they did not have a proper judicial proceeding within a reasonable time. Article 19, freedom of expression. Article 21, freedom of peaceful assembly, and they were peaceful. Article 22, freedom of association. Article 25, freedom of participation in the conduct of public affairs. Article 26, discrimination, because they were being discriminated because they were Catalans. So it's a horrendous thing. But Spain has a network of supporters in the European Union. I suppose there's a big price to pay for Spain. So I scratch your back, you scratch my back. I don't know what Spain did so that it was not sanctioned. Certainly, Spain violated gravely Article 2 of the Treaty of Lisbon. But they didn't start a proceeding under Article 7 like they did against Viktor Orban or against Poland. So it's an anomaly where you have here a breakdown of the rule of law in Spain. You have the impunity of those who committed acts of grave police brutality, and Brussels is silent about it. So I also advised the government. Since I put out several press releases in Geneva in my capacity as independent expert, the Spanish government invited me to go to Madrid. And interestingly enough, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights did not want me to get into this affair. They wanted me to shut up. And they said there was no money for my trip to Spain, which of course there was. Of course there was more than enough money for me to go to Spain. But I said, I have no particular desire to speak to them. They don't seem to be, shall we say, open to any kind of reasonable discussion, so why waste my time? Interestingly enough, they actually insisted to speak to me, and the advisors, the senior advisors of the then Prime Minister Rajoy, came to Geneva to see me. And I met them for 3 hours in the Spanish mission. And their argument is that self-determination ended with decolonization. And I told them, where have you been for the last 30 years? You think that it ended with decolonization? Or what happened to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Macedonia? You think that that's not self-determination? I mean, international law progresses. So obviously, decolonization was part of self-determination. But certainly, shall we say, destruction of the territorial integrity of the Soviet Union, and the destruction of the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia was applauded by the European Union. So what's the matter here? Why cannot a population of 7.5 million Catalans who have territory, population, government, relations with other states, they have all the qualities of a state. Why can't they have it? If they want to have it, huh? I don't care. If they don't want to have it, come here. But I told the government, look, this is an important decision. I wouldn't force it. I would make a gesture to Carles Puigdemont, and I would say, look, have your referendum, and then we'll talk. But we're not about to recognize the results of the referendum if all you get is 51, 52%. I mean, this is much too an important decision. It has an enormous economic impact. So I think it's reasonable to demand that you have a participation of 2/3 of the electorate, and of that 2/3 of the electorate, those who actually go to the polls and vote, you need 2/3 that want independence. I thought that I was reasonable because I don't think that the Catalans would have had it. I think that in the best case scenario, the Catalans have 55%. I don't think they can reach 60%, or they can reach 66, 67%. I doubt it. In any event, that would have been a civilized way to go about it. You make a nice gesture, you tell them, go ahead, do it. And then there's no real consequences. But the Spanish government and the advisors of Rajoy were very thick-headed. First of all,
Hardline approach.
I thought that they were bad lawyers. I had the feeling, had they been my students, I would have flunked them. They were just adamant, intransigent, arrogant, unpleasant. But again, I kept my readiness to speak to them, although I realized that I couldn't expect anything out of it. So, having said that, the sequel of the affair is that there are political prisoners in Spain today. There are 12 Catalan ministers and others who are sitting very long jail terms of 9 and 13 years just for the crime of having organized a referendum. I mean, it is surrealistic. And that in Europe. You tell me that happens in Togo, or that happens in Myanmar, in Burma, or in North Korea, I would believe it. But that happens here in Europe in the 21st century?
The two quick follow-ups on Catalonia before we get to other
Kashmir, the Tamils, yeah. There's a lot.
So two quick follow-ups on Catalonia is what exactly is the apart from the language, what are the cultural distinctions of Catalonia that makes them feel very distinct as a separate nation from Spain, and why do you think and why do you think the Spanish government doesn't just approach this issue of a referendum, as you suggested, the way the Brits did with Scotland, or the way Canada has done with Quebec?
Well, I think that the Spaniards, who have, of course, a difficult history. They have the Civil War, they have the 40 years of Franco, etc. They are afraid that if they allow the Catalans to hold their referendum, That will be followed by the Basques, that will be followed by the Asturians, that will be followed by the Galicians, etc., and that the country will fall apart.
Yeah, should.
That, you know, my proposal also to the government is how about change the constitution? You make it into a federal state, and then you have all of these units, and each one of them is an autonomous state within the Spanish Union. That would function. And then everybody has a feeling that they can do their thing. But back to the history of Catalonia. If you have been made a victim, if you are almost a historical, traditional victim, if you've been oppressed for a long time, that creates identity. That you have the identity of a victim of injustice. And that is not easily forgotten. Madrid has been traditionally incredibly arrogant with everybody. I mean, I myself come from, shall we say, a Spanish noble family. And I know, and I've met counts and I've met marquises in Spain. It's a different world, the mentality. And the arrogance of a Grande de España, actually, that's what they call themselves, the big guys of Spain, los grandes, uh, is very humiliating for those who are not grandes. And the Catalans do not forget the genocide that was committed against them by this nasty Frenchman, Philippe d'Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV, who was imposed on Spain as the new king when the Habsburg line died off. That was 1713. You had the War of the Spanish Succession. You had the Treaty of Utrecht. The Treaty of Utrecht guaranteed the autonomy of the Catalans, and almost the first thing that this Philip V, Philip of Anjou, who didn't speak Spanish, he was born in Versailles, and he was very, very much French. First thing he did is just to devastate Catalonia. I mean, there are several square kilometers of the very center of Catalonia that were just laid bare. And then they built the citadel there.
Okay.
And the Catalans don't forget that. I mean, they were subjected to particular humiliation, say, like the Ukrainians under the Nazis. So you don't quite forgive that. The same thing in the relations between Poland and Germany. The Poles who lived through the Second World War and their children are not likely to forget the kind of arrogance that they endured under the Nazis. So these things actually create identity. And Madrid has done nothing to diffuse that problem. And as I said, if the Catalans want to stay in Spain, so much the better. But that must be their decision and not ours. So moving away from this immediate issue of self-determination,
Yes,
the issue that remains, and it's actually quite acute, is the issue of political prisoners in Europe and the issue of political exiles in Europe. It is absolutely inconceivable that someone as decent as Carles Puigdemont, someone who in his entire career, he has been a model Democrat, and he has been a person totally committed to peaceful means, totally committed to dialogue, that this person has to live as an exile in Brussels, in Europe, in the 21st century, is absolutely ridiculous. And the fact that the Tribunal Supremo in Madrid has asked the European Parliament to strip him of his immunity, which the European Parliament did a week ago. I mean, it is beyond words. I mean, it's a total betrayal of European values by the European Parliament. I mean, it's Orwellian what we're seeing. I mean, I'm very concerned about the breakdown of morals, the breakdown of ethics in Europe. And who is responsible for it? Ursula von der Leyen, the German, any number of parliamentarians in Brussels who don't give a damn about human rights. They just instrumentalize human rights. They weaponize human rights to do their thing, and they're very happy drawing the very good salaries. This is the
Yeah.
kind of bureaucracy in Brussels that is destroying the European Union. And I mean, if the European Union continues the way it goes, you're going to have, as you had Brexit, you're going to have Poland saying bye bye. You're going to have Slovakia saying bye bye. You're going to have Hungary saying bye bye, and Greece. Except that Greece has been so totally devastated by the European Union and by the European Central Bank that they're just lying low and hoping to survive. I mean, they have become a colony of Brussels. I have great sympathy for the Greeks and for what's happened to them. So let's leave that issue because we can talk about Catalonia
Exactly.
for days. You had raised the issue of Kashmir.
Yes.
And
Yeah. I wanted. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, where does international law sits on the issue of Kashmir? Because I'm sort of like Armenia. I was very much. I'm very much neutral on this issue because you talk with you talk with people from India, you have a completely different interpretation of history and what happened, especially after partition. You talk with people in Pakistan, they'll give you a completely different side of the story. And then, of course, you have the people within Kashmir who sort of don't really who don't really see eye to eye with either India or Pakistan. So where does the whole issue of Kashmir lie? Where does international law side with on
well,
this
let's
topic?
go back to 1947. 1947, when the Indian subcontinent split, and when Pakistan was separated from India, and of course it was still East Pakistan, which today is Bangladesh. So out of the Indian subcontinent, you end up having three states: Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. And then here in the north, in the Himalayas, you have this gorgeous area called Kashmir,
Yeah.
known because of the Kashmir sweaters. And in any the United Nations tried to keep the peace in the Indian subcontinent at the time of decolonization, and the Indian uh, leaders, in particular, one fellow um, called Sardar Patel. Uh, Sardar Patel was a, shall we say, fanatical Indian who wanted to give the least possible to Pakistan and wanted to grab as much land for India as possible, notwithstanding whether the population would rather have been with Pakistan, notwithstanding the fact that the population was majoritarian, so 77%, 80% Muslim. So he didn't want a referendum. The United Nations Security Council, pursuant to Resolution 47, did ask for a referendum. And
Yeah.
they established a United Nations mission to the area. The referendum never took place. Why? Because India didn't want it. And notwithstanding the fact that again and again in General Assembly resolutions the issue has been raised, India always manages to weasel out of the responsibility. And recently, they abolished the autonomous status of Kashmir. They basically militarily occupied Kashmir. They have a reign of terror in Kashmir. Again, the only solution actually is a referendum. And India knows it's going to lose it. And that is why India doesn't let it happen. And India is very powerful, is richer than Pakistan. And they actually militarily occupied the territory of Kashmir. And they violate the rights of the Kashmiris right and left. And I mean, there's no human rights in Kashmir. I mean, I wouldn't want to be there.
Yeah.
And there, as far as I'm concerned, the fault is entirely on the side of India. I mean, I have very many Indian friends, and I, get invited to lecture in Delhi, and India has a fascinating culture, and they have so many good things, but like in the United States, the American people are lovely people. But look at who's governing. Huh. I mean, it's not like the
Or Turkey.
Indians are bad.
Turkey.
It's that they have awful governments. I mean, it's not like the Turks are bad, but Prime Minister Ecevit, the one who invaded Cyprus in 1974, and this megalomaniac called Erdogan, I mean, these are tough cookies. But again, Donald Trump was a tough cookie. And Donald Trump gave America a very bad name in the world, as did George W. Bush. I mean, basically, whether Democrat or Republican, all American presidents tend to be imperialists,
Yeah.
tend to be unilateralists, tend to be exceptionalists, etc. The one exception,
Yeah.
the only one exception I can think of is Jimmy Carter, whom I have a lot of, shall we say, respect for. But other than Jimmy Carter, in the Democratic Party, you have someone like Bill Clinton, totally corrupt and immoral to the core, and a very good speaker, and someone who's amoral. I don't like that. I don't like to see that the greatest, most powerful country in the world is led by somebody with no morals. And when it takes the word morality in the mouth, it is just lip service. I mean, there's nothing behind it. So, I mean, you cannot, shall we say, condemn a people because they have a bad leader. As I said, Americans can be wonderful, Canadians can be wonderful, Australians can be wonderful, but usually their leaders are not. And as far as Kashmir, I don't see light at the end of the tunnel because there's no readiness at all in India to negotiate this. And the current Prime Minister Modi actually has a lot in common with Sardar Patel. With this individual I mentioned, he died in 1950, but he was, shall we say, the strong man of India. You had the idealist, Gandhi. You had the romantic, Nehru. And then you had the realist, if you want, the Machiavellian one, who was Sardar Patel. And I think that Modi is cut of the same cloth as Patel. So I don't see any progress there. And the best case scenario is that the Indians, shall we say, remove the military occupation and that they allow at least a minimum of human rights. But part of the problem is disinformation and the wrong perception in the mainstream media. This mainstream
India.
media tends to be pro India. So
Okay.
they tend to, shall we say, whitewash the crimes being committed against the Kashmiri population. And they underreport. When there are nasty things happening on the side of India, they don't report about it. If there is, shall we say, some violence originating on the side of the Kashmiris, then they're terrorists. That's one of the worst things that happens. It is the one tool that the mainstream media uses to defame, denigrate national liberation movements. That's why, for since time immemorial, the Palestine Authority, before that the PLO, was classed as a terrorist movement. Although the General Assembly has any number of resolutions stating very clearly that a national liberation movement has the right to fight for self determination, including by force, by violence. It is recognized in international law that a national liberation movement has the right to fight for self determination. But that was, shall we say, at a time when the Europeans thought that maybe colonialism had its day, and they didn't think that it was going to last very long. So the mainstream media of Europe and elsewhere all jumped on the bandwagon of decolonization. I mean, decolonization did not happen just because the Africans took their sovereignty back. Uh, it happened because it was not viable anymore economically.
Yeah, they had to restructure, and they even
And
restructured
then,
the
and then, of
system.
course, they try to sell it to you as a human rights movement. And but then, once you believe that there's a human right to self-determination, you say, well, yes. Well, how about in Kashmir? Oh no, they're terrorists. Oh, why not in Turkey with the Kurds? I know that the Kurds are terrorists. They're not. I mean, the most scandalous situation in the world as far as self determination is concerned is that you have 45 million Kurds who have been split into four countries. You have Kurds left as a minority in Syria, in Turkey, in Iraq, and in Iran. So they've been split into four. They're not allowed to build their own country. And when the Kurds of Kurdistan held their referendum in 2017, which was overwhelmingly for independence, nobody recognized it. So, I mean, those European powers that applauded the unilateral declarations of independence of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia Herzegovina, Kosovo, etc. Where are they when the Kurds declare themselves independent
Actually,
following an overwhelming referendum? At least a referendum was allowed to be to take place.
so let's talk more about the Kurds in a moment. But first, let me ask you, what are your thoughts, and where does international law sit with the Tamils in their self determination away from Sri Lanka, and do explain that long overlooked and long forgotten conflicts that happened, which ended very brutally with Sri Lanka eviscerating the Tamils in their push for self-determination, for
Well,
independence.
I mean, that is yet another scandalous situation, and the mainstream media has a lot of responsibility for the false perceptions that many people have. The fact is, here you had uh, an island with two distinct ethnic groups. You had the Sinhalese and the Tamils. And for administrative reasons, when the Brits had their empire, of course, they tried to put people together. It's, an administrative decision that at that particular moment didn't have many human rights implications. And it's never a referendum to ask the Tamils, do you want to be together with the Sinhalese? You just put together with Sinhalese. When you had the independence of Sri Lanka, that would have been the moment for the United Kingdom to organize a referendum, but of course it didn't. Or that would have been the moment for the United Nations to step in and suggest, here there are two distinct peoples. Should you not give them a chance to express their preference? No, no. You just put them together. You make them a new state and let them deal with it.
And did the British favor the Senhalese over the Tamils, or did they favor the
Actually,
Tamils
no,
over
they
the...
played one against the other. The the Brits have been extremely successful colonialists for centuries. And I would say, in a scale of 1 to 10 of hypocrisy, I think the Brits take 12. I mean, the Brits have been the most hypocritical colonial powers ever, but they've been successful. And they've had the press with them, they've had the media with them, so that there's still a certain, shall we say, admiration, awe for the British Empire. Of course, and that is because you're conditioned to have it, because you're indoctrinated into having it. Having said that, the United Nations could have done something, it didn't. And the Tamils have had the same fate as the Kurds. They have been defamed as terrorists. And that is something that I have discussed with Ben Emerson, the UN rapporteur on human rights while combating terrorism. And he, of course, agrees that the Tamils got the short end of the stick. And that it is unfair to call them terrorists, and it's unfair to disregard all the resolutions of the General Assembly about national liberation movements, but that is where we are. Now, decolonization has brought many injustices. Another classical one is the one with Mauritius, the island of Mauritius and the archipelagos around it, including the Chagos Islands.
Yes, John Pilger did a brilliant documentary called "Stealing a Nation" about that. Yeah.
Well, the even United Kingdom courts have decided that the people of the Chagos Islands who had been illegally evicted of their homes and forced expelled actually of the Chagos Islands had the right to return to their homes. Of course, never implemented. Part of the problem is that at the moment of decolonization, the Brits, because the United States had asked them, we want Diego Garcia, we want that island. And they offered so much money to the Brits that the Brits decided to sever the Chagos Islands from Mauritius and only allow Mauritius to become independent without the Chagos Islands. Now, that went to the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice said that this decolonization was imperfect, that this colonization was in violation of international law, and that Great Britain has the obligation to return the Chagos Islands, including Diego Garcia, to Mauritius, which, of course, the United Kingdom doesn't think of doing anything of the kind. And it's like when the United States got condemned because of the military and paramilitary activities in Nicaragua case. That was 1986 International Court of Justice judgment. The United States ignored it. So that's a great problem with international law, that there's no enforcement. We don't have a mechanism of enforcement.
Quick question on Diego Garcia before we move to I wanted to talk to you about what was it? Before we move into Taiwan, I wanted to ask why can't I mean, I'm not for the U.S. military having bases anywhere, but why can't
I pay for it? My bloody taxes pay for that.
but why can't the U.S. and Britain just allow the Chagosians back into Diego Garcia, and they live side by side with the U.S. Military bases there? Like, why does it have to be this relentless population efforts?
I would imagine that Diego Garcia is full of nuclear weapons, and is full of many nasty things, and it is probably very secretive. And the United States is not about to let anybody in the secret. So United States is blocking. So it's non-negotiable. It's illegal, violation of international law, but since the United States violates international law with impunity every day, I mean,
Britain is also an outlaw state, as the brilliant historian
just add it to the list. Now, there's no longer really a necessity militarily to have so many naval bases. We have more than 800 in the world. It costs us a fortune to keep these naval bases going, because today, with the mobility of nuclear submarines, and nuclear submarines all equipped with nuclear missiles, etc. If you have an enemy, you can pretty easily move your submarines close to that enemy. So it's not really necessary to have a physical base, which of course everybody knows the base is there. And I have no doubt, for instance, that if China wanted to destroy Diego Garcia, it could do it. They probably have missiles that could annihilate Diego Garcia, or for that matter, Russia, or for that matter, possibly even Iran. So I don't think, the strategic advantage of submarines is that they're all over in the oceans, and they are very mobile. Whereas if you have a point like Diego Garcia, it really can be attacked through missiles from the air with big bombers, etc., etc. So I don't see the added value to maintaining Diego Garcia. It's more a question of prestige. The United States wants to be perceived as the strongman, and the more bases, the better. That is more or less the attitude. Same with Britain. You want something as ridiculous as the Falkland Islands? I mean, it's such a residue. It's such a leftover of imperialism Great Britain is bankrupt. I mean, Great Britain has nothing to say in the world today, basically. But they still live from the illusion that they're a great power. They're not a great power.
Well, Mr. Zayas, they still have a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council, which they get to veto, and unfortunately, try telling a Venezuelan, a Syrian, an Iraqi that the British Empire no longer exists. I think they would beg to defer because of all of the damage that the
they have
Anglo
a
American Empire
privilege.
Five Eyes Alliance have done.
They have a privilege that they don't deserve to have, but in the reorganization of the world in 1945, they were sitting on the side of the victors. Although I would say, I mean, it's not the United States who won the war, Russia. I mean, Hitler was not brought down by the US. And all of these massive 1,000 bomber swarms that destroyed Dresden and Kassel and Hamburg and Dortmund and Frankfurt, it had no impact on the war. What won the war was Zhukov, Marshal Zhukov, and his soldiers that actually physically invaded Germany and got rid of Adolf.
Yeah.
But of course, in history books, you don't get that anymore like that. It's the history book gives you the illusion that it was the brave American soldiers. And as far as the Pacific, I find it absolutely grotesque that 75 years after the crime against humanity, not to call it genocide, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is still being accepted as a legitimate use of force to end the war. Sorry, the Japanese were trying to make peace with the Americans since 1944. They'd been using all their feelers, all of their diplomatic contacts and middlemen in order to reach some sort of an armistice with the United States, etc. They were defeated, and they were already defeated in 1943, and they knew it. They wanted out, but they wanted out with at least a measure of honor. And that is what I so much hate of the Anglo-American mentality.
Mm-hmm.
We are so damn arrogant that we demand unconditional surrender. We want you to go on your knees, and we will decide what your fate is. I mean, it's absolutely for people who claim to be Christians, for people who claim to have some, shall we say, commitment to human dignity, for people who claim to have some commitment to the sense of equality. I mean, what we do is just brutal force. We are by definition the good guys, and you're by definition the bad guy, period. There's no if and no but. It's the same attitude as George W. Bush formulated it. You're either with us or against us. You can't be neutral. There's no middle way. I mean, we tell you what to do. That's it. And of course, that was the situation with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, we committed one of the greatest crimes in human history, and it's still being whitewashed in history books. In history books and in the mainstream media.
Well, speaking of the British Empire, where does international law side with the Tamils? And you already talked a bit about the Kurds, And can I ask you to go back into the Kurds and how international law should respond to the grievances of the different Kurds in the different respective countries that the Kurdish people are based in: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and
I'd like to see an evolution. It cannot be from today to tomorrow a complete flip flop and a new state emerging with 45 million Kurds. That won't happen. You can have the United Nations intercede with the four governments concerned to grant at least these people autonomy, and maybe revisit the issue in 10 years or in 20 years, hold a referendum to see whether they really want to have independence, whether they want to create a new state. It would be viable. They have resources, they have population, they have territory, they could have government and relations with other states. So it is a viable entity. But it's only because the major powers don't want it. They enjoy the idea, divide and conquer, that they can, deal with the Middle East as long as the Middle East is split like that. A new state that would be a state that emerges out of self-determination, they don't want that. They can do as much lip service to self-determination, but ultimately they don't want self-determination. They just want it in specific cases where it suits their geopolitical interests. Otherwise, no. And when I mentioned the Kurds, I mentioned the Tamils, who definitely have the right of self-determination, and I don't quite understand why, because I don't see the geopolitical interests in Sri Lanka, why they were so totally abandoned by the world, why the world watched on while 100,000 Tamils were massacred, why you could have this kind of genocide without the mainstream media saying, look, responsibility to protect, look, necessity of doing, humanitarian intervention.
Yeah.
I mean, there you would have had a case for humanitarian intervention. You would have had it in Rwanda. You would have had it in Cambodia. What did the international community do? Zero. Where did they do it? In Libya, where it was oil. So they created all of this hullabaloo about human rights violations by Gaddafi. Gaddafi was a son of a bitch, but he was actually good to his people. Certainly there was no justification whatever for responsibility to protect and intervention in Libya. And you know who's the guilty party there? I mean, of course, the United States and the United Kingdom have blood in hands, and plenty of it.
France, Nates from the EU, yeah.
Nicolas Sarkozy. Nicolas Sarkozy gets now convicted and sent to jail for 1 year. Of course, he's appealing. He got a 3-year sentence, of which one is supposed to sit it out. And of course, for irrelevant things, for far less important things. People get convicted for banal things. They don't get convicted for the real crimes. I mean, for me, Sarkozy should be in jail for the rest of his days because of what he did to Libya. The same thing goes for George W. Bush. I mean, 1 million Iraqis lost their lives because of that totally inexcusable invasion, which, by the way, as far as I'm concerned, it's the greatest violation of international law since the Second World War. It was a revolt against all of the Nuremberg principles. And not only the United States the United States managed to pull in 43 countries of the so-called coalition of the willing, 43 countries ostensibly committed to international law, to human rights, to non-aggression. I mean, it's complete, shall we say, destruction of the fiber of international law. And, anybody, I mean, ask Noam Chomsky or ask Dan Kovalik or ask Francis Boyle, and they will say the same thing I'm telling you. But you won't read it in the New York Times, and you won't read it in the Washington Post, because they're all in it. They all benefited from this. So they don't want to do it. So going back to the Tamils, yes, of course they have a right of self-determination, but they're not about to get it. And about the only way that I could see that you could advance with a perception, a different perception, would be if, say, the International Criminal Court picks up the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed there and investigated, and then that you cannot completely hide. Or if the General Assembly sends a couple of issues to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on the right of self-determination of the Tamils, that could give them at least some visibility as people who actually have some rights. But right now they're terrorists. They're bad people. No, it's offensive. It's offensive, but we live in a fake, phony world. And now Taiwan.
Yes. I wanted to ask you. So I wanted to ask you a question about Taiwan, because I've been covering a lot China the last several episodes of 1+1, and now I'm against the pivot to Asia. I'm against the building of Anglo-American and the Five Eyes militarism surrounding China on the south of the China Sea. And I would rather, that the powers to be all get along with one another, and we have détente so that we can avoid, climate catastrophe and nuclear annihilation. But one thing I tend to disagree with a lot of my friends who are communists, who are Marxists, and who do advocate de-escalating, tensions with China, is the issue when it comes to Taiwan. And I do believe that China does commit human rights abuses. Whether it's half truths or full on fake news is another issue. But on the issue of Taiwan, I do believe that Taiwan should be an independent country, separate from China. But where does international law actually side when it comes to Taiwan, and how would you resolve that issue?
Taiwan is a de facto state with a population of 80 million and a huge GDP. I mean, Taiwan is a rich country with a very well-educated population. Now, Taiwan emerged as the representative of all of China at the time that Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, and he was hoping, with the help of the United States, to be able to go back to the mainland. And of course, Mao Zedong established his regime and his cultural revolution and everything, and Chiang Kai-shek was never able to go back to China. Now, since all of this, more than 70 years have elapsed. In 70 years, you have basically different consciousness that have emerged. There is a specific Taiwanese consciousness and identity, and there's no reason why they should not be able to have independence. And I am persuaded that Beijing would allow that if you could make it palatable to them. Because you don't have to control the land physically. You can control it economically. And uh, China, of course, in this issue is being adamant, but it's also being adamant because the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe are being adamant. China, obviously, like every country, is going to be pushing its own interests, not yours and not mine, theirs. But they have every right to. And they feel encircled. They feel that they are the butt of a consistent pattern of xenophobia, a variety of xenophobia, and they don't like it. They don't like the fact that the United States goes and sends its battleships and its destroyers and its airplane carriers to go on a journey in the South China Sea or close to Taiwan, etc., etc. Those are unnecessary provocations. And we're always saber rattling. We're always provoking the Chinese. If the Chinese would realize that we're going to let them be, that we're not going to continue this ridiculous kind of Cold War that we have against China. I'm sure the Chinese among themselves, the Taiwanese and Beijing could reach some kind of a compromise among themselves without us, without the US sticking its fingers into it, or the United Kingdom sticking its fingers on it, or Europe sticking its fingers on it. That's a matter for the Taiwanese and the Chinese. And I think they have a hell of a lot in common, historically, mentally, etc., etc. I mean, China is not Mao's China. China is a capitalist, a state capitalist country. That's what it is. And it's now a very wealthy country. Also, Taiwan is a very wealthy country. I don't see China bombing or killing Chinese. They're not into that. I mean, China has a fascinating history. If you look at it, they have been a remarkably peaceful empire. They have not been an empire that has been expanded. The only exception, I would say, is Tibet. Tibet, of course, was for a period part of China. It was a question of sovereignty. Who was the sovereign? Our Western conceptions of sovereignty have evolved. But there were, in the time of the Qing dynasty and the 15th, 16th, 17th century, where Tibet was administered by China. So there is a prehistory of, shall we say, a symbiosis between the two.
Okay.
I once spoke with a senior Chinese diplomat about China, about Tibet. And I said, say, the West is always hitting you over the head because of Tibet. Why don't you just let them be? Why don't you just give up your claim to sovereignty over Tibet? And, you know, the diplomat looks at me with a very benevolent smile. And he kind of just shakes his head a bit, like saying, you silly boy, you naive person. And he says, in the kind of world we live in, the moment we are out of Tibet, NATO comes in. The moment is not going to stay as a happy province governed by the Dalai Lama is not going to stay as a uh, happy bunch of monks in the Himalayas. It is going to be militarized by the other side. And since we don't want to have any headaches, uh, we prefer to have our buffer zone. And Tibet is a buffer zone. Again, as long as we're there, the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe don't come in. The moment we leave, you don't know. So that was the explanation, quite honest explanation of a Chinese senior diplomat, and I think it made a lot of sense. But I say, you know, notwithstanding, I think it is possible to give the
It's a
Tibetans far more human rights and far more, shall we say, leeway.
the right to
And
practice their
I think they're
the right to practice their unique Tibetan Buddhist
exactly,
culture
exactly.
without any
I
marginalization.
think there are a lot of Chinese who think that that is possible, but that's what also with the sanctions policy and with this American policy of maximum pressure. Don't they realize, for heaven's sake, it's so easy to understand. If you threaten a country, if you impose sanctions on a country, if you try to impact nastily the economy of a country, that is war. It just happens to be a non-conventional war.
Yeah, war by
Uh,
other means.
and the country feels threatened. The country decides that constitutes a national emergency. If their economy is really being hurt, that is a national emergency. And since time immemorial, all countries in situations of national emergency, they have emergency legislation. And it's even allowed in the field of human rights. Uh, Under Article 4 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, you can derogate from Article 9, uh, arbitrary detention, which means in a moment of national emergency, you can arrest and detain people without the guarantees that they normally would enjoy. You can derogate from Article 14. You can throw people in jail and not give them a fair trial and not give them a trial at all in times of national emergency. You can cancel freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful manifestation and freedom of association. And of course, freedom of conduct of the public affairs, I mean, elections and that sort of thing during a war. Nobody will doubt that you can do that during wartime. But how about a situation of national emergency that can be even more serious than an actual war? Where, for instance, Germany during the Second World War, until pretty late, they remained very rich. They had plenty to eat. They had plenty to drink. Things, I mean, life continued. The sanctions that the United States has imposed on Venezuela has made the life of Venezuelans grind to a halt. The sanctions that the United States has imposed on Venezuela has caused countless misery, has caused unemployment, has triggered massive emigration because people have nothing to eat. Why don't they have anything to eat? Because the country cannot even buy it. The country is not allowed to sell its oil, it's not allowed to sell its gold, it's not allowed to sell its lithium. The banks don't transfer the money. So that is, in a very real sense, war. And in wartime, you are allowed to have emergency legislation. So if you want human rights, for heaven's sake, stop provoking, stop threatening. The moment that China does not feel threatened, the moment that Venezuela doesn't feel threatened, the moment that Cuba doesn't feel threatened, they can provide a détente. They can provide more human rights. They can provide for freedom of expression and for freedom of peaceful manifestation, etc., etc. But if you clamp down on a country, the country is going to actually resist. The country is going to say, well, I cannot afford the luxury of allowing all of these dissenters to further complicate affairs by demonstrating on the streets. So we don't want that. We have to see how we manage a difficult situation. And that's what Maduro has done. And obviously, that is also what China does. I mean, if, as I said, my not only my diagnosis, but actually my medical recommendation as a doctor would be the best medicine if you want a healthy democracy and a healthy society where human rights can be enjoyed is don't destabilize the society. Don't create a national emergency in which the government fears that it can be toppled. And of course, if it was homegrown, if you tell me that there is a homegrown opposition to Maduro, I assure you, if there really were, they would have toppled him already. Take Cuba. Cuba governed under the Castro brothers and now under Miguel Diaz-Canel, a communist, anything you want. But there is, shall we say, very little corruption. There is a fair distribution of wealth. There are no great differences between the super rich and the poor. I mean, some people have a little bit more than others, but people tend to accept it because there is social justice. There's free medical care, free hospitals, there's free schooling all the way up to university and graduate school.
Very little of that caste class distinction that unfortunately is a curse on much of the Latin American and the Caribbean region.
So I mean, if and that's where the U.S. has miscalculated. U.S. thought, I'm going to make it difficult on them. We're going to impose these economic sanctions that are going to break them. Well, it would have broken a country that does not have a sense of history, a country that does not have a sense of honor, a sense of identity, etc. If you have a country like the United States, rags to riches, a country that where the only thing that counts is money. I mean, in the United States, the value of a human being is measured in dollars. So how much money you have. The fact that you happen to be a great painter or composer or something is totally irrelevant unless you're rich. If you're rich, they'll recognize you.
Yeah.
If you're not rich, they won't. So they don't. The United States doesn't understand that the Cubans rather be Cuban, rather do their thing, rather feel independent from any colonial power, than bend down and let themselves be purchased for money. I mean, it's a different mentality. And the United States simply does not want to accept that that exists. The United States thinks that every human being just wants money and that you can buy happiness with money. And it's amazing how the United States has succeeded in convincing itself that that is the way other people also function. They don't. I mean, all the indigenous peoples of Latin America function differently. All the indigenous people in Australia or in Rapa Nui or in West Papua, these are not their values. Their values are family. Their values are just being happy now. I mean,
Yeah.
happiness is now. It's the sense of equilibrium, the sense that you feel happy the way you are. That is what the United States fails to understand. And if you understand it, and certainly Noam Chomsky understands it, uh, they think you are an intellectual. You are, you know, out of a different world. But you don't have nothing to say. And the funniest thing with the American freedom of expression is that why is Noam Chomsky allowed to say what he says? Or Francis Boyle, or Dan Kovalik, or so many other good thinkers that are running around in the United States? Because the system is so entrenched that they know that Noam Chomsky is not going to make a dent. They have such control over the economy and such control over every aspect of your life that they can afford to have this old man saying silly things because it's not going to change anything. So, bravo, we have freedom of expression. Yes, we don't have to.
Well,
We don't have to kill him because it's not going to change things. On the other hand, for some of us who do read Chomsky, at least he gives me a sense that, shall we say, humanity has not totally given up, has not totally gone mad. There's still people who have values and people who can think and can be logical. And I last time I saw Noam, I said, Noam, how can you stand there for the last 60 years? You've been writing the best analysis of the situation in the world. I mean, you've written so many fantastic books that sell, and you're popular, you're known. How can you stand that nothing changes? And then the man looks at me. I think I told you once because I still.
yeah, I know the story, but it's
He tells
interesting.
me I'm 63 years old. The last time I saw him, and he looks at me and says, "Young man, we do what we can and what we must." It's just it says it all. I mean, he is not so, shall we say, such an idealist that he thinks that he has the key
Hmm.
to wisdom and that people will actually want that key, that they will listen to him. He says, I do what I can, and maybe someone after me will pick it up and do something positive with it. But it's actually the man oozes an aura of tranquility around him. I mean, it's like he's seen it all. He realizes that humanity is mad, but that humanity has always been mad. And somehow it survives. So, I mean, if you can input some good ideas like Jean Jacques Rousseau, it's amazing. We all think so much like Jean Jacques Rousseau, and he was the first one to formulate these ideas. And they went into our consciousness. So maybe the ideas of Noam Chomsky will gradually go into the next generation and people will actually function with it. But again, I
Yeah,
think that we are
yeah.
losing your readers, your viewers. So I think we postpone other topics for a future day.
Yes. Well, I think that's a perfect way to end it. So, So on this special edition of One Plus One, talking about the issue of self-determination in regards to Catalonia, the Kurds, Sri Lanka, the Tamils, Kashmir, and of course Taiwan. And so we were joined on this special edition of One Plus One with the great Alfred Zayas. And by the way, Mr. Zayas, you are one of our most frequent guests. I've noticed you're one of our most frequent guests, and it's always an honor to speak to you. I look forward to having you back back on the future, because it's always an honor to treat you. And also, we have 204 subscribers now on of this YouTube channel. I think we have 80 something followers on Twitter, and I'm always upset when when the episodes with you are don't get the views they deserve. But I think the powers that be are trying to do a bit of a gaslighting trick.
Also, send them to my blog, because I put a lot of good stuff in the blog, and also good stuff in my tweets. So if you go Alfred Zayas Twitter, you will find a lot of rather politically incorrect stuff. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So, at this happy note, wish you a lovely weekend.
Yes, I'm wishing you a lovely
actually,
weekend.
I'm looking forward to going to Belgium in order to meet you.
Yes, it would be it would be an honor to actually finally meet you in person, have you over at.
And I have a lot of friends in Brussels, and I have a lot of friends in Antwerpen, and let's see when the COVID is over.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So that we
have to pray that this pandemic goes away.
Again.
We can.
Yeah. Okay. All the best. Yeah. Take care.
All the best to you too, Mr. Desires. Thank you very much.